February is known as Black History Month, but how can we fit that rich and diverse history into less than 30 days? It's almost criminal to limit the stories of some of the greatest inventors, innovators, intellectuals, rule breakers, and game changers to 1 month of focused learning. From the contributions of Africa to the effects of the diaspora and beyond, it is vital that the history of Black people be integrated into our lives beyond the shortest month of the year. Let's start with some of the usual Black history suspects: MLK, Malcolm, Jackie, and Rosa. We know these names and their impact on Black culture as leaders, pioneers, and trailblazers. It's truly difficult to quantify the influence of Martin Luther King Jr. His impact spreads across multiple intersections of race, humanity, and politics. But every February, we try to sum up his life with his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But what about the boy from Troy, John Lewis, who was a towering figure in the American Civil Rights Movement? But his strength carried his beliefs with him into a long-term tenure as a U.S. Senator. Lewis was one of the original freedom fighters, challenging segregated interstate travel. His unwavering commitment to nonviolent resistance became a hallmark of his activism. Depending on where you live, the impact of Malcolm X is hardly even taught because of his radical approach of "by any means necessary" is still considered dangerous. So we definitely aren't talking about the impact of men like Stokely Carmichael. Later known as Kwame True, he was as radical as they come when it came to fighting for the equality of Black people all over the world. He started as a member of the Freedom Fighters along with John Lewis, influenced by Dr. King. However, he began to adopt the tone of Minister Malcolm, even becoming a target of the FBI as the next Black messiah following Malcolm's death. Jackie Robinson is typically the go-to athlete discussed during Black History Month. His integration into Major League Baseball was monumental, but there were plenty of athletes that broke through before Mr. Robinson came along. What about boxer Jack Johnson, who became the first Black heavyweight champion in 1908, or John Baxter Taylor Jr., who became the first Black American to win a gold medal in the Olympics the same year? We bet you've never heard about Charles the Black Cyclone Follis, who became the first professional American football player in 1902. Rosa Parks is usually only talked about in terms of being a tired lady who simply refused to give up her seat. But this well-trained and highly intelligent woman was not at all a weary traveler. The Black women of that era need their own curriculum. Rosa Parks' defiance on a Montgomery bus in 1955 is celebrated as a courageous act that sparked the Civil Rights Movement. However, the historical context of her resistance and the actions of other Black women who challenged segregation are often overlooked or overshadowed. Prior to Parks' arrest in 1955, other Black women, including Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith, had also challenged segregation on Montgomery buses by refusing to comply with discriminatory seating policies. Pauli Murray worked closely with the movement leaders, but frequently criticized them for the way they sidelined women in the movement. In 1965, Murray became the first African-American individual to receive a JSD from Yale Law School. During that time, she coined the phrase "Jane Crow" to describe the discrimination she received not only for being Black, but also for being a woman who dared to strive as a lawyer. One of the most powerful and passionate voices of that time came from Fannie Lou Hamer. Hamer coined the term Mississippi appendectomy to describe the harmful medical practice of forced sterilizations of poor Black women deemed unfit to reproduce. She herself was a victim of this malpractice when she went into surgery to remove a tumor, but in turn was sterilized. Ms. Hamer still went on to lead efforts in voters' rights and economic improvement for Black people. But the way Black History Month typically highlights the Civil Rights era, you'd think that we started with slavery and then started marching. But there was so much in between and before. Rarely taught and explored is the affluence of Black towns that thrived and displayed Black independence, affluence, and ability to build together. Maybe you've heard about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that showcased Black excellence. But have you ever heard about Allensworth? In 1910, a born slave and former colonel, Allen Allensworth, founded a utopian community for African Americans looking to escape the ills of racism and segregation. Located 2 hours north of Los Angeles, Allensworth became a place where Black Americans could truly control their own destiny. There was established California's first African American school district. Allensworth also had its own courthouse, hotel, and library. What about Seneca Village in New York City? Seneca Village was founded in 1825 by free Black Americans. At its peak, Seneca Village was a bustling community of middle-class Blacks and working-class Irishmen. 3 churches, 2 schools, 2 cemeteries, and almost 400 people. At the time, it was one of the only places African Americans could buy land and exist free of harassment and discrimination. Seneca Village was seized by the state of New York. Today, that once thriving community is covered by one of the most famous landmarks in the world, Central Park. How many students are being taught about the history of Overtown in Miami? What about the once thriving community of Rosewood, Florida? We all know about the attempted coup of January 6, 2021. But do you know about the only successful coup that happened in November 10, 1898, and that it was a direct response to black affluence? Almost 30 years after the end of the Civil War, that puts whites and blacks on the front lines against each other. Wilmington, North Carolina, stood as an early example of what could happen if they worked together. The Republican Party of Wilmington consisted of black aldermen, elected auditors and financiers, deputy clerks, superintendents, even Republican President William McKinley named a black man, John C. Dancy, as a U.S. Collector of Customs at the Port of Wilmington. Wilmington was the home to black businessmen and working class alike. In retaliation to the upward movement of former slaves and born freedmen, this resulted in the only successful coup in American history when democratically led rebels laid waste to the once thriving black town and seized control of every political seat by force. It would take years of detailed education to break down the effects of the different eras throughout black history. We need to properly learn about the Reconstruction era. Following the end of the Civil War marked a significant period of transformation and upheaval as the nation attempted to rebuild and integrate Southern states back into the Union, thus birthed the Reconstruction era. The term Reconstruction refers to the various political, social, and economic efforts to address the aftermath of the war and the abolition of slavery, as well as to address the rights of the newly freed African American population. Beginning around 1865, the Reconstruction era had profound and far-reaching effects on American society, particularly in the South, starting with shifts in politics. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to African Americans, and the 15th Amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote. Freedmen and their families sought to establish new lives in a society that was still largely hostile to their presence. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, aimed to assist former slaves by providing food, housing, education, and medical care. However, white Southerners resisted Reconstruction efforts through both legal and extra-legal means. Sharecropping and tenant farming became prevalent systems in the South. Many African Americans, lacking land and capital, entered into agreements with landowners that often left them in a cycle of debt and economic dependency. Efforts to redistribute land and provide economic independence to freedmen largely failed. Black codes, laws passed by Southern states, sought to restrict the freedoms of African Americans and maintain a labor force similar to slavery. The Compromise of 1877 effectively ended Reconstruction by withdrawing federal troops from the South, leading to the restoration of white democratic control and the onset of the next era. Enjoying our content? Consider becoming a member of our team by clicking the Join button. Your impact will contribute to us being able to make more and more content like this. While the Reconstruction era saw efforts to integrate formerly enslaved African Americans into society as equals, the end of Reconstruction marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era. The Jim Crow era refers to a period of racial segregation and disenfranchisement in the United States, primarily in the Southern states, from the late 19th century into the mid-20th century. Southern states, determined to maintain white supremacy, enacted a series of laws designed to marginalize African Americans and strip them of their newly acquired rights. These laws and mandated racial segregation in public facilities and services were upheld by the 1896 Supreme Court decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, which established the separate but equal doctrine. During the Jim Crow era, African Americans faced systemic discrimination and violence. Segregation laws affected nearly every aspect of daily life, including education, employment, housing, transportation, and public accommodations. Voting rights were severely restricted through various means, including literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses, effectively disenfranchising the majority of African Americans in the South. Economic opportunities were also limited, as black people were often relegated to low-paying, menial jobs and faced discriminatory hiring practices. Racial violence was rampant during this period. American terrorist groups, like the Ku Klux Klan, terrorized black communities to maintain racial hierarchy and suppress any efforts at civil rights advocacy. The legacy of the Jim Crow era continues to affect American society today. It led to great movements like the Great Migration and the amplified civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s in order to dismantle those injustices. The Great Migration led to one of the most impactful eras in black history. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, social, and artistic explosion centered in Harlem, New York, spanning the 1920s. The movement originated as a response to the Great Migration, during which hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from rural South to urban centers in the North, in search of better economic opportunities and a respite from racial segregation and violence. Harlem became a cultural epicenter for African Americans that fostered a spirit of racial pride and cultural expression that would characterize the era. The era saw a burst of creativity across various art forms, Literature flourished with works by writers such as Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, and Gene Toomer. Jazz and blues music, performed by artists like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Bessie Smith, became immensely popular and influential, contributing to the broader American cultural landscape. This era fostered a sense of racial pride and encouraged African Americans to celebrate their heritage and identity. The art portrayed the African American experience with dignity and complexity, challenging stereotypes and pushing back against the pervasive racism of the time. Intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke promoted the idea of the talented tenth, a leadership class of educated African Americans who could uplift the race through culture and intellectualism. This era also saw increased political activism, with figures like Marcus Garvey advocating for Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism through his Universal Negro Improvement Association. The cultural output of the Harlem Renaissance had a lasting impact on American culture. Jazz, in particular, became a dominant genre in American music, influencing subsequent generations of musicians. Of course, several days of the month are always dedicated to American chattel slavery. From elementary and on, African American history is often taught as if we made it through slavery and skipped toward the civil rights era. We are often given assignments on the Middle Passage or reminded of how we worked as free labor to build America into a superpower, depicting African Americans as passive and beaten into submission. But were you taught about any of the numerous acts of rebellion? Throughout history, the narrative of chattel slavery in America has often been framed through a lens that downplays the resistance and rebellion of enslaved people. From the transatlantic slave trade to the antebellum South, enslaved Africans and African Americans fought against their oppressors in a variety of ways, challenging the notion of a passive acceptance of their plight. Contrary to popular belief, the reality is that slaves did indeed rebel against their enslavement, often in daring and courageous ways. From small acts of resistance, such as feigning illness or breaking tools, to large-scale rebellions like Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 and the Stono Rebellion in 1739, enslaved people actively resisted their oppression whenever and wherever possible. Of course, Harriet Tubman deserves her own month just to truly deep dive on her impact. But how much do you know about Sojourner Truth? Sojourner Truth was more than a former slave. She was a self-educated, powerful orator and advocate for human and women's rights. Her famed "Ain't I a Woman" speech is still regarded as one of the most impactful speeches ever given. But did you also know, in 1828, that she was the first Black woman to win a lawsuit in the United States? Upon learning that her 5-year-old son had been sold by his New York owner to an Alabama slaveholder, Sojourner filed suit on the grounds that the sale of her son to a slave state violated the provisions of New York's emancipation law. Not only did she win and regain custody of her son, but the judge waived all of her court fees. What about those who rose from the ashes of dehumanization? Madam C.J. Walker was born into the first generation pro-slavery. She went on from an uneducated laundress to the first Black American millionaire. Her entrepreneurial journey began in the early 20th century when she developed a long line of hair care products specifically designed for African American women. Mrs. Walker built a thriving business empire that encompassed beauty salons, manufacturing facilities, and a robust network of sales agents. Her dedication to providing quality products and empowering other women to achieve financial independence revolutionized the beauty industry and laid the foundation for future generations of African American entrepreneurs. Benjamin Banneker, who was the result of a marriage between a slave owner and a slave, a pioneering genius whose specialized knowledge in astronomy and mathematics led him to being a prominent figure in the construction of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. How about the two illiterate former slaves that started and founded a historically Black university? In 1862, ex-slaves James Tate and Grandison B. Daniels established the first school in Atlanta for African American children. This school was originally located in an old church building. Along with 25 other former slaves, they began holding classes in the old church. After a few years, the school officially became Atlanta University in 1865 and was chartered with the assistance of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867. Today, that HBCU is known as Clark Atlanta University. Still here? Make sure you hit those subscribe, like, and share buttons. It is often presented like all Black people during the early days of America were enslaved or that they were unskilled and alone. That's far from true. Evidence shows that Africans made landfall 180 years before Christopher Columbus made claims to finding America. Historians believe Mansa Abubakar II, king of the ancient kingdom of Mali in West Africa, may have led an exploration that made landfall in America. In 1311, he sent some of his men with enough provisions to last them years on 200 ships to explore the limits of the ocean until they find what is behind the Atlantic Ocean. The ships never returned. However, Christopher Columbus reported in his journal that the Native Americans confirmed black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading in gold-tipped spears. The Native Americans described the spearheads as guanin, which means gold in the Mandinka language, a language of the Mali Empire. Columbus also reported seeing mosque-like buildings when he arrived in America. In fact, the people from the Kingdom of Mali were Muslims, so they may have built mosques while here. African skeletons were discovered in America, and studies show that the skeletons are from the 13th century and most likely related to Mansa Abu Bakar's voyage. Now, if you want to only subscribe to the notion Africans only came from America via slave ships, the unspoken relationship with Native Americans are very well documented. The relationship between African Americans and Native Americans was shaped and shared by experiences of oppression, displacement, and resistance under European colonial powers, and later the United States government. Early encounters came because Africans and Native Americans lived in close proximity, particularly in the Southeast. This led to formed alliances, intermarriages, and shared cultural practices. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, intermarriage between African Americans and Native Americans was relatively common. This led to the creation of mixed-race communities. These communities often provided refuge and support to many runaway slaves, creating a blending of cultures and traditions. Tribes like the Black Seminoles, Brass Knuckles, and the Shinnecock are all tribes that intermingled Native Americans with the formerly enslaved or free men. These formed alliances also showed up during battle. For example, during the Seminole Wars in Florida, the Seminole tribe included many African Americans, both runaway slaves and freedmen. These Black Seminoles fought alongside the Seminole Indians against U.S. forces. Another skill that came from these cultures mingling was how to till American soil, thus resulting in Black ranchers and cowboys. The history of Black ranchers and cowboys in America dates back to the early 19th century, although their roots can be traced to even earlier periods. Native American cattle handlers taught African Americans the cowboy way of life. Others learned the cowboy way of life from Mexican or Spanish cowboys. Historians estimate that 20 to 25% of cowboys in the American West were African American. Over time, Black cowboys played a crucial role in the cattle drives that moved large herds from Texas to railheads in Kansas. Estimates suggest that about 1 in 4 cowboys was African American. They performed all the tasks associated with cowboy life, from rounding up cattle to branding and driving them over long distances. Black cowboys were known for their exceptional skills in horsemanship, cattle herding, and roping. Their expertise was crucial in managing the vast herds and dealing with the challenges of life on the trail, including hostile environments, weather conditions, and the threat of rustlers. Despite their significant contributions, Black cowboys often faced racial discrimination, but in the meritocratic environment of ranchers, where skills and reliability were valued above all, it allowed Black cowboys to earn respect and status among their peers. Famed cowboys like Bill Pickett, for instance, became famous for inventing the technique of bulldogging or steer wrestling. Nat Deanwood Dick Love wrote an autobiography detailing his life as a cowboy, providing valuable insights into the experiences of Black cowboys during this era. To this day, the idea of a Black cowboy seems radical, but is nothing but a return to our historical roots in America. So how are we supposed to fit all of this into 1 month of learning? We haven't discussed the titans of industry, the great inventors and innovators, people like George Washington Carver, Garrett Morgan, and Jerry Lawson. 29 days in a leap year to learn about the contributions of Fred Hampton and the Rainbow Coalition, or Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party. Most schools teach Shakespeare, but where are the classes that focus on the works of James Baldwin or August Wilson? The importance of Black history being taught all year round is not only because we have an extensive past, but because Black people are still making history every day. In politics, you have the Obamas and Ketanji Brown Jackson to learn about. Future businessmen and women will need to learn the works of Robert F. Smith and David Stewart. They will teach about the Black innovators in tech like Marquez Brown Lee and Idris Sandu. We need more than a month to talk about redlining, the war on drugs, the 1994 crime bill, and the countless encounters that led to the Black Lives Matter movement. Black history is American history. It is imperative to put the history of our culture into everyday conversations and education. Our history did not start at slave ships or the slave ports of St. Augustine and off the coast of South Carolina. Our history stretches across the diaspora and has roots in American soil before the inventions of shackles. We encourage you to explore our other videos and also to do your own research. Comment below and let us know what else we should learn about when it comes to our history.